So, in creative writing, what we're looking for is some key points. It's a recipe, as I call it. So, what you need to look at most of all is try and do 5 paragraphs to structure your work. This is actually a mark scheme to describe a storm, but you need to basically talk about using senses: sight, sound, smells, touch, taste. You need to make sure your opening sentence gets the reader interested, and you need to make sure your last sentence is a clear ending. The language that we're looking at is you have to have lots of interesting, sophisticated vocabulary. So use lots of interesting verbs, adjectives, and adverbs. Use the rule of 3: tall, tall, thin, and white-haired. It's much more interesting than tall or thin or white-haired. So use rule of 3. Also make sure that you try to use weather action adverbs. So always say about what the weather's like and try and use personify the weather. The sun smiled angrily, or the sun frowned angrily, or the sun smiled cheerily. The rain whipped determinedly across my face. The wind blew happily. Make it interesting. Have you used tenses correctly? So lots of students forget to use tenses correctly. So have you actually used your tenses correctly? Always write in the past tense if you're doing the past tense, and just check that you don't drift into the present tense. So use and under your language, use imagery, metaphors, and similes. She looked like a witch. She looked like a princess. She looked like a frog. All of those things make it. She was cold as a frog. It's a great simile. Or she was as beautiful as a unicorn. I don't know. Use similes. Use onomatopoeia, which is particularly useful describing if it's a storm, crash, the thunder rumbled, or onomatopoeia is really helpful if you can actually bang, crash, wow. Yeah, so those things that are helpful as well, which makes words that sound like they actually are. Growled, snarled, snitched. Got the hiss, hasn't it, of snitch. Most importantly here is, have you used a good mixture of simple, compound and complex sentences? Are your sentences of different lengths? Have you used conjunctions, subordinating conjunctions, as, when, while, whereas, after, before, since, so, because, despite the fact that, even though? Try and use a different conjunctions. Try and use 8 types of punctuation. So 8 types of punctuation is exclamation marks, speech. What else could you have? Full stops, semicolons. If you don't know how to use a semicolon, look it up. Subordinating clauses, fronted subordinating clauses. Look at the first word of each sentence. Do they all tend to be the same? So use fat and grumpy. The dog sat in the middle of the road. Sounds much more interesting than the dog sat in the middle of the road, isn't it? So try and put 2 adjectives at the beginning of your sentence. Boring and long, comma, sometimes a school day can appear like an extended battlefield. Or sociable and educational, comma, sometimes a school day isn't long enough. How lovely, two totally different versions of the same thing. if all your sentences start with the same sentence, then we've got a problem. Same idea, like I. So you can use subordinating clauses. After I had eaten my breakfast, I dashed out of the house. There's a subordinating clause. Or you can use having eaten my dinner, I left. Determined to make the most of this particular day. So that is using a participle to start it, an ing word. The two adjectives I've talked about. Oh, and happily, adverbs, happily, sadly, determinedly. Those are other ways of starting it. All right. So if you're in doubt, look at Mr. Bruff has got a good video on that, on sentence starters. So's Mr. Biggins. Spelling, punctuation and grammar. So as I said, have you used a range of punctuation, including exclamation marks, commas, ellipsis, there we are. Commas, exclamation marks, ellipsis, speech. Yeah. What else could you use? Oh, brackets, dashes. So we need to go through those as well. If you don't know how to use brackets, dashes, commas, exclamation marks, semicolons, ellipsis, speech, then that's about 8, isn't it? Is your spelling of common words accurate? So make sure that any common words, and there is a common spelling list of words that everyone spells wrong. So make sure you know those things like management, business, communication, commodity. Well, that's not a common word. Accommodation. All those words that everyone spells wrong all the time. Effective. Oh, snapped. Those double consonant words as well. There is a rule for that, so we can look at that. Do your sentences make sense when you read them back? Are your verb tenses correct? Have you missed out any words? Have you written in proper sentences? Always proofread. Try to exaggerate. Always, when you're describing anything, always use a description that you maybe have written before. Throw it in, a description of a person or a place. Try and sort of remember what you wrote and try and put that in as well, because you'd have sort of honed and perfected that. Okay, so that's just a short video to remind you of some of the aspects of your the recipe that I do. There's also another video called Locked Out that goes through it. All right, I hope that's helpful.